Welcome everybody to my next video on lime plastering or patching lime plastering. We're going to be looking at outside this time rather than internally, as my other videos have shown. This house has obviously had lots and lots of cracks in it. I've done a fair bit of repair work all the way along the front of the house, as you can potentially see. I'll be covering that front door a little bit later, and also how to rebuild the sash windows. For the moment though, we're more interested in the lime plastering. Although this house has two types of covering, one is a cement render and the other one is lime. The lime is actually above the sill. So looking here, you can see a faint line under the windowsill. Above this is lime plastering or lime rendering, and below is a concrete render. So we have to use different methods for repairing both sides. So I'm going to show you how to repair a patch in the lime, which is above the windowsills upstairs. And I'm also going to be showing you how to try to repair the cement render below. And I'm going to be using stainless steel threaded bars and some resin just to show how you can stitch these two together. So you can see at this end of the house, that lime rendering at the top is in a pretty bad state. In fact, the centre section has actually physically come away from the lathes and actually is in danger of falling away. There's quite big gaps there where moisture and rain can get into, so it certainly needs doing. If you can see below on the right hand side, you can see what looks like a couple of crosses. That's where I'm going to show you how to repair the concrete render or cement render, which is below the windowsill, and it actually runs most of the way around the house. Right, let's look at the cracks right down the bottom for the far right hand corner. This crack actually runs all the way up, almost the entire sort of 2 levels of the house. You can see it there, it winds all the way up right to the top, and that panel to the left there, that's actually where most of the lime plaster is pulling away from the lathes and is almost in a position to fall off. So we've obviously got to deal with that as soon as possible. These cracks are actually in the cement render. It looks like it's just the paint that's cracked, but actually these go quite a bit deeper. Not particularly wide cracks, but they're wide enough to be concerning. Right, so let's get started. I need to do a little bit of gardening first. Hopefully my wife's not looking. I need to saw down a couple of these plants because I need to get some scaffolding up around here to make it safe. This is really important. You really do need to be on a platform if you're going to be working at height on your house. And you know, for a few £100 to hire the scaffolding, it's actually a really good way to go forward. I've tried it off of the top of a ladder, and to be honest, you actually can't hold things in both hands. You're very, very restrictive. So safety first, you need to put scaffolding up. Okay, right, so that's the plant almost destroyed. I better not tell the wife. That's just me scratching my head in the background there, because I'm a little bit worried about what she might say. Anyway, the dog dug them up. So I've got my grinder here, and it's actually a diamond grinding wheel. I've found this really probably the only one that lasts. I've probably had this about 6 or 7 years. And it's only a cheap eBay cutter, but it really does do the job. I'll show you another couple of cutters here actually. So there's the diamond wheel for cutting stone on the left hand side, and the blue disc top right hand side, that's a sanding disc, but it will really cut into timber and to paint, so it's really good. The one below, that's a steel cutting disc, and it's a very fine disc. Very, very thin. It's probably only about 1 millimetre, maybe 1.5 millimetres thick, but it is absolutely superb. Right, so let's get cutting. The basic idea is to just widen the crack a little bit, just to allow you to get some cement in there or whatever filler you're using. I normally use Tropet, really good cement-based material, which goes deep into the crack. You can push it in with a nice sort of paint scraper, but clear all these cracks out as much as you can and get as much paint away from the edge so that when you put the filler in you get a really good finish. Now, because this crack is quite wide and quite extensive, what I'm actually going to do is to try and do what I would sort of loosely term as being stitching. And basically what you do is you cut a slot across at 90 degrees to the crack, open that up, and that then allows a gap for about 7 or 8 inches across the crack. You can open that right up, and you want it deep enough and big enough so that you can actually put a piece of threaded stainless steel rod into the hole and bond that using a resin-based adhesive, which you can buy readily in tubes. It actually does the mixing actually in the tube, and I'll show you that a bit later on. Anyway, so once you've done your grinding, give that a good brush down, get rid of all the dust and dirt and grime, and make sure it's clean, as fresh as you can. Obviously, when the concrete cracks, or when the cement cracks, it does tend to shift. So the idea of putting these metal rails in, or rods in, is actually to stop that movement and to support one piece of cement render to another. Right, so I've done my stitching probably about 1.5 foot apart, something like that. Depending on how extensive the cracking is, will depend on how many of these that you need to actually physically put in. So let's look at how we put these in. First of all, you need a grinder, and the disc I mentioned earlier, which is the thin disc, that's for metal cutting, and it's ideal for cutting stainless steel. Now I'm using 6mm stainless steel threaded bar, and you can buy this in sort of 1 metre lengths. It's really good, nice and easy to cut. Just trim them off, as you're seeing here, and it doesn't really matter about the accuracy of your length. I'm just cutting them approximately 6 inches long so that they actually go into the hole. So as you can see, I've cut those and they're all ready to use. Right, okay, so this is where you put the steel rod, or the threaded rod, and what you're going to do is to squirt some material straight into the slot all the way along, just as like a bed, and then what you're going to do is to push the threaded rod into that, and then cover the whole of that threaded rod up to the surface of your cement render. And what you can do, you can actually use a spatula just to smooth that out so that it doesn't sit too proud. Right, this is the material I'm using. It's Fisher, it's a resin. It comes in handy packs. I think these are about sort of 10 quid each. What you actually physically get with them is a couple of nozzles, which are the mixers. So inside the tube is a couple of bags which squirt out and mix within that tube. Don't use the first couple of inches of the material that you squirt out, because it's mainly hardener. The manufacturers actually say that you can reuse the tube, but to be honest with you, I just ensure that I've cut enough slots to use up most of the resin out of a tube. So in summary, cut a nice slot, a little bit longer than the threaded bar that you've got. Put a bed of the material, the resin, into that hole all the way along. Push the threaded rod into it so it's below the surface, and then add some more resin over the top and smooth with a palette knife so that you get a fairly flat surface. You can grind this off afterwards, so don't worry if you've overfilled. Normally what I do is to do that and then run the grinder over there with a flat wheel just to reduce it below the surface, and then I put some Tropet filler over the top and then sand that down afterwards to get a reasonably flat finish, and I'll show you that a little bit later on. Right, back to the lime plastered part of the wall. This is the bit up the top. It's always in a difficult place, isn't it? So I'm going to have to reconfigure the scaffolding so that I can get up there successfully. But for the moment, the centre panel right in the middle there, that actually needs to be taken off and to reveal the lathes underneath. And there you are. It looks worse than it is. I don't know though. It maybe is quite bad. You need to take off as much loose plaster as possible, but use your own judgment. I mean, don't. You can take it all off and square it off, but in this particular instance, the adjacent pieces of plaster seem to be fairly well fixed to the wall. But the piece that I actually removed, well, the lime mortar underneath had actually dried out completely, and it was all crumbly, so it was falling away from the lathes. Right, so the first thing you want to do is to knock out some of the old plaster from the gaps between the lathes, and this will allow your new plaster to push in the same way as the old plaster did when it was first done back in the day. So when you get all that cleaned up, the best thing to do is to get yourself a nice big brush and give it a good dust down and remove all the little loose bits and pieces that are knocking around, and make sure there's no dust between the lathes themselves. And as you can see here, I'm giving that a good brush down just to make sure it's as clean as possible. Basically what you're going to do is to apply a PVA adhesive to this. Now some purists might actually say that you can't do that because it doesn't allow the walls to breathe. But to be honest with you, all these walls are covered in years and years of plastic paint, and you can actually see in places where the paint has actually peeled off, and it's almost in thick sheets. So a small panel like this, it doesn't actually matter if you put the PVA on it. What you don't want to do is to seal the whole house up. But let's put some PVA adhesive on here. I'm putting it onto the lathes as well. The lathes are actually in quite good condition, but it's important that you get a good level of adhesive all the way over, so that when you put your layers of plaster on, it's got something to key against. In this particular instance, what I'm going to do is to fill up the hole where all the lathes are with lime plaster, and then I'm going to put a very thin coat, or the thinnest coat I can, over the whole wall from that corner edge that you see there all the way across to the window. And what this will do, it will actually allow the piece that I've plastered to look nice and uniform, but also blend in with the rest of the wall. Right, let's just stop here for a second because this is important. So when layers and layers of paint are put onto the outside of a house, they tend to form like almost a sheet. And when you come to sort of grind bits off, you'll notice that the paint actually just picks off. So the only way to sort of resolve this, apart from peeling the whole house, which I don't particularly want to do, what you do is you use a razor blade or a Stanley knife and cut along the line that you want, and then carefully bend the paint back so that it snaps at that cut line. And then effectively what you've got is paint that's on the wall which is pretty much fixed. It's not perfect, but it's pretty much fixed. And then the balance of that, where you're actually going to be doing the plaster, you can actually just peel that off, and that gives you a nice square edge. Then what you can do when you put the PVA on is to try and dribble some of that PVA between that sheet of paint and the wall itself. But just be aware that loose paint actually will start to bubble and everything else, so make sure it's fairly well fixed before you continue. Right, you can see now that all of that PVA adhesive has been put on there, and that the rest of it looks within reason fairly secure. Look at the lathes, they're in excellent condition up there, and normally they're the ones that get full of woodworm and start to deteriorate and fall off. But I'm quite happy to plaster straight onto that because that will give me quite a nice good key. Right, so let's just summarise the process. I'm going to be filling the hole up, as you can see, up to the surface, or almost up to the surface of the surrounding plaster. And I'm going to allow that to dry off a little bit, so that when I put the second and third coat on, you won't actually be able to see that gap. What tends to happen is if you put too much plaster in there, it takes a long time to dry, or a fair time to dry. And when you try and go over it and get a really good flat coat, what happens is, because the thick plaster is actually quite pliable, your float will actually push into that, and you can't get a very good finish. So stick to my advice, put layers on at a time, let them go off in between, and just keep building that up until you're at the right level, and then you can put your final two coats on. And by final two coats, you can put them almost immediately on after each other. It's just a way of building up and getting a reasonably flat surface over what looks to be a pretty undulating surface. You would have noticed just then that I'm forcing the lime plaster in between the lathes so that it curls over inside and acts as a hook to hold the plaster onto the surface. This is what they would have done originally, but of course, because some of it's filled up with old plaster, you can't necessarily actually do that. Right, so what you need to do is to look over the whole of the lathes and that little bit on the left hand side, and start to fill up all the areas with the lime. Now you notice I've got that fairly thick, and that's sort of intentional because I don't really want it sliding off of the float. But always put your float on the underside of where you're working if you're able to. This just means that if anything falls off, it'll fall back onto your float, and then you can scoop it up and put it back onto the wall. So you're building this up as much as you can. I've probably got a difference between where I'm plastering and the actual final finish surface, probably about an inch, maybe a little bit more. And as I said earlier, what you want to do is to build this up in layers all the way across. And what this does is to ensure that when you actually put your final coats on, you've actually got a level, fairly hard bed on which to, or surface on which to actually do your plastering. So work all that in as much as you can. Where you've actually physically got broken plaster, which is sort of bottom left hand side, make sure you get plenty of plaster in there and squeeze it in with your little float and push it up against the edges. What you're trying to do is not just sort of fill the hole, but fill it right into all the extremities, and that'll actually give it a fair bit of strength then, and enable it to last a few winters, or well, maybe a bit more than a few winters. After all this work, it wants to work a lifetime. So the first coat, as you can see there, 15 to 20 millimeters. Wait until it's almost dry, and depending on the day, it'll probably take a couple of 3 hours just to harden off. And by harden off, I mean when you push it with your fingers, you can leave a slight impression. Any wetter than that, and you'll have a job to fill that hole up and keep it nice. So once you've done that, what you want to do is to just go across the surface of this, because you're putting another layer over the top. You want to provide a nice strong key underneath, and all you use is just the edge or the corner of your float or trowel, and just put some cut marks into it. Just make it as rugged as possible, but obviously make sure none of the peaks are sticking out beyond the final finished surface. Right, okay, I've probably done as much as I can leaning across from a tower, so what I've had to do is to put another tower up. I'm fairly fortunate in that I've got a couple of towers, one really old one which I've had for donkey's years, and a new one which I bought for the business. So what I've managed to do here is to actually go over the top of a yew bush. I don't really want to take the yew bush out because it's quite an integral part of the garden, and the wife will kill me. So I've put two towers, one either side, with its supports, and I've put a platform right over the top of the bush. And as you can see, that gives me a really nice sort of surface to work off, nice and safe. I've got a safety bar there, and whilst it's not very far to fall, you don't have to fall far to hurt yourself. So be warned, get yourself a tower and make life a lot easier for yourself. And you can spend as much time as you like up there then playing around and putting your plaster on. So as you can see, what I'm doing here is to just to sort of start to get a covering over the existing plaster work, and this is really just trying to build up the level so that I know what the final level is going to be, and therefore the patch that I've done on the right hand side there, where it's deep fill, I can then build that up to the right level so that it's all nice and flush all the way across. So when you're plastering, what you need to do is to make sure that your float is always at an angle. So never try and have your float flat on the wall, because what will happen is when you stop and pull the float away, it will actually suck all the plaster off. So as you can see here, if you look closely, I'm actually tilting the float about 5 degrees, lifting up the leading edge, and then when you get to the other end and you go back on yourself, you want to tip the float the other way so the leading edge is in front, and then run that right the way across. Now I've put a coat on that, and I'm slowly building it up, getting it nice and close into to the window frame. I want to make sure that I don't get any sort of cracks down there. But all the time as you're plastering, don't overwork the plaster, but because you can do quite a bit when the plaster's almost dry. But you want to go around, and where it looks like there's a hole when you've passed the float over, if it looks like a hole, just grab a daub of lime and just stick it in the hole, and then smooth it out again. And here you can see that I'm actually using a float as well as a very small, I suppose you'd call it a paint scraper almost. It's just something which has got a nice curve in it, and it's nice and polished on the outside edge, so that actually when you take it across the plaster work, you don't actually drag it. And incidentally, the float I'm using is actually a stainless steel one, and stainless steel is much better because it doesn't rust, unlike a standard steel float. And what happens is when it rusts and you don't clean it off properly, you can't get yourself a good finish. Right, that looks like that's just about ready to put the final coat on. And again, just push it in with your finger, and if you get a little tiny mark and it feels reasonably dry, then it's time to stick your final coat on. And the final coat really only needs to be a couple of millimetres, and just spread that right across, work it across right to the corners and the edges, just filling all the holes up as you go. But you shouldn't have too many of them because the wall is basically flat. All you're doing is just putting a final finish on there. Right, word of advice. If you get that panel too flat, it will look wrong in relationship to the rest of the house. Walls aren't upright, they're certainly not level, and they're certainly not flat. So if you make it too perfect, it will actually stand out a mile. So any undulations in that surface, that's just going to match your existing. So don't worry too much about it. Okay, just a reminder, don't forget, keep the trowel just slightly tipped up at the leading edge, and it's the trailing edge that's actually doing the levelling. Otherwise you'll just rip all the plaster off and you'll get into a bit of a mess. So for the observant among you, you would have noticed that there's a slight bit of pargeting on the top half of the house. And this is just lines just in the style of a brickwork. So what I'm going to be doing is to actually replicate those onto the new plasterwork. I'm going to be using actually a pointing trowel or pointing steel, which has got a slightly curved surface and a nice bit of straight timber just to act as a guide. Actually, I'm using this stick as well as a rough guide to the position of the marks on the wall. So just make a little scratch mark, replicate it on the wall, join the two dots up, and away you go. I think builders actually call this a storyboard, and it's just a piece of wood that you can keep a record of all dimensions on so that you can replicate it elsewhere in the house. Now, the interesting thing is you've got to decide when actually you can do this, because the plaster needs to be slightly dry but not too dry, so you can actually still move it on the wall but there's no moisture coming to the surface. So on the plaster, it will take a while for you to actually physically get used to the best time at which to actually do this work. But what you need is to make sure that the plaster is not wet on the surface and it's just movable on the surface. So as you push the plaster, you can see it sort of smoothing out nicely. It's quite a critical point actually while you're doing the plastering, just to choose that time dead right. Otherwise you tend to rework the plaster, and overworking it doesn't do it any good at all. But what I'm doing here is where I've run the profile across the wall, it's actually raised the edges, and so what I'm doing is just to smooth those down and then redo the profile. And it's just a case of working along just to make sure that that you're actually happy with the finish. And don't forget that what you're trying to do is to actually match the existing. So the existing has got little bits missing where people have filled it up in the past, but it doesn't really matter as long as you've got a bit of a profile there. People won't actually notice it. It's now just ready for paint, and you're all done. And here's the paint. It's not quite dry yet, still a little bit patchy, but I'm pretty pleased with that. That looks the part. It doesn't look out of place. There's a couple of bits which I might want to go over a bit later, but for all intents and purposes, that's a finished job. Right, okay, so what we're going to do is just a quick summary of some of the do's and don'ts. Remember, do not plaster if there's a potential of frost, otherwise it'll totally wreck what you've plastered. Concentrate on blending in with the old and the new. That needs to be done as carefully as possible. Don't rush, take your time to get it right. When you're painting, new plaster that is, work the painting with a smaller brush and make sure that the paint is soaking in. Don't put too much on, don't try and cover it first time. Wait a day or so and then repeat with another coat over the top. As far as the cement rendering is concerned, don't forget you're really only sort of slowing down the process of these big panels moving. If you've got a real problem where the panels are look as if they're going to continue to move, then you may well need to get some professional help to have those panels taken off and have salivite and then a lime plaster rendering put over the top. But for all intents and purposes, if you can slow it down enough that it doesn't bother you, then this is a really good method of achieving that. Right, so thank you very much indeed for watching. I hope you've enjoyed that video. There are other videos on doing lime plastering internally, and of course from our sponsor, Dry Ice Restoration. And if you want to give this a bash and repair some of your outside walls, have a go. What could possibly go wrong?